February 12, 1771. A Swedish king sits down for what will become history's most legendary final meal. King Adolf Frederick doesn't know he's about to earn himself a nickname that will outlast every political decision he ever made. The monarch who literally ate himself to death. 14 servings of Semla, a rich cream-filled pastry, will transform an unremarkable ruler into one of history's most bizarrely memorable figures. This isn't a story about war, betrayal, or political intrigue. This is about a man whose stomach became his executioner, whose appetite wrote his epitaph, and whose death proved that sometimes the most ordinary people create the most extraordinary endings. The historical records don't lie about what kind of king Adolf Frederick was. They barely mention him at all. You won't find his name alongside the great military strategists or political masterminds because he was neither. When he took the Swedish throne in 1751, he inherited a crown that had been deliberately stripped of its shine. The Swedish parliament, fresh from decades of royal overreach, had crafted a system designed to make kings into expensive decorations. They succeeded magnificently with Adolf Frederick. Every decision that mattered, military campaigns, trade agreements, diplomatic relations, flowed through parliamentary channels while the king watched from the sidelines. His signature appeared on documents, but the words were written by other hands. His face appeared on coins, but the economic policies came from other minds. For 20 years, Adolf Frederick ruled over a kingdom that had learned to rule itself. The Age of Liberty, historians called it, though for the king himself, it felt more like sophisticated imprisonment. Parliamentary sessions continued whether he attended or not. Treaties were negotiated in his name but without his input. The machinery of government hummed along smoothly, powered by elected officials who treated their monarch like a constitutional afterthought. Foreign diplomats quickly learned that flattering the king meant nothing. Real power lived in the parliament chambers, not the royal palace. This wasn't incompetence on Adolf Frederick's part. The system had been specifically designed to prevent another strong monarch from centralizing power. Previous Swedish kings had dragged the nation into costly wars and expensive adventures. Parliament's solution was elegant. Keep the monarchy for ceremony, strip it of substance. Adolf Frederick understood his role perfectly. He showed up when required, said the words expected of him, and retreated to his private quarters where his opinions actually mattered. 20 years of being Sweden's most visible powerless man had taught him to find satisfaction in smaller things. Palace life offered compensations that politics couldn't provide. Adolf Frederick discovered that being powerless in government meant being completely powerful in his personal pursuits. He threw himself into craftsmanship with the dedication other kings reserved for warfare. His workshop became his true throne room, filled with wood shavings and half-finished furniture projects. The king who couldn't craft laws could craft cabinets. Religious study consumed his mornings the way military strategy occupied other monarchs. He approached theology with scholarly intensity, finding in spiritual texts the intellectual challenges that political documents no longer offered him. These weren't casual hobbies. They were serious pursuits that gave meaning to days otherwise filled with ceremonial emptiness, but luxury called to him most seductively of all. Without the stress of actual governing, Adolf Frederick developed an appreciation for life's finer pleasures that bordered on the excessive. Rich foods, expensive wines, elaborate meals. These became the rewards for enduring another day of political irrelevance. Kitchen staff learned to prepare increasingly indulgent feasts, not for state occasions but for the king's personal enjoyment. He ate like a man making up for lost power, as if each elaborate meal somehow compensated for another parliamentary decision made without him. The royal dining room witnessed culinary experiments that would have impressed visiting dignitaries except they were performed for an audience of one. Adolf Frederick's appetite grew alongside his political frustration. Food became his kingdom, the one realm where his desires were law, where his commands were followed instantly, where excess was not just permitted but encouraged. Palace records show orders for increasingly elaborate ingredients, exotic preparations, multiple courses served at single meals. The king who ruled nothing ruled his dinner table absolutely. This wasn't gluttony born from ignorance, it was indulgence born from compensation. Every rich sauce, every additional course, every extra helping represented a small victory against the constraints of his constitutional cage. Adolf Frederick might have been content playing the role of Sweden's ceremonial king, but his wife had very different ideas about what royalty should look like. When he married Louisa Ulrika of Prussia in 1744, he wasn't just gaining a wife, he was bringing a political tornado into his comfortable, powerless existence. Louisa Ulrika came from Prussian royalty, where kings actually ruled with iron fists and armies trembled at their commands. She arrived in Stockholm expecting to find a throne with real power, only to discover her husband was essentially a well-dressed figurehead in a parliamentary puppet show. The Swedish nobles had already neutered the monarchy during the Age of Liberty, leaving Adolf Frederick with about as much political authority as a court jester. But Louisa Ulrika refused to accept this arrangement. She spent years scheming, plotting, and pushing her husband to reclaim what she believed was his rightful authority. Palace records show she constantly urged him to challenge the parliamentary system, to take back the power that previous kings had wielded. Her ambitions weren't just personal, they were dynastic. She wanted to build a legacy, to establish a monarchy that their children could inherit with pride. The tension between the royal couple and the Swedish parliament became a constant undercurrent of palace life. Louisa Ulrika organized secret meetings, cultivated relationships with dissatisfied nobles, and even attempted to orchestrate political coups. Her husband, however, lacked both the stomach and the political acumen for such dangerous games. While she burned with ambition, he preferred his woodworking and religious contemplations. This fundamental mismatch created a marriage built on political frustration. Louisa Ulrika's letters reveal a woman constantly exasperated by her husband's passivity, his willingness to accept limitations that she found intolerable. She had married expecting to become a queen in the traditional sense, wielding influence and shaping policy. Instead, she found herself trapped in a gilded cage, married to a man who seemed perfectly content with his captivity. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Here was a woman with the political instincts and ruthless ambition that might have made her an effective ruler, married to a man who possessed the crown but lacked any desire to use it meaningfully. Their relationship became a study in wasted potential and mismatched expectations. Despite her efforts, Louisa Ulrika never succeeded in transforming her husband into the aggressive monarch she envisioned. The Swedish parliamentary system proved too entrenched, too well established for even her considerable political skills to overcome. Adolf Frederick remained what he had always been, a king in name only, content to let others make the decisions while he pursued his personal interests. By the time of his death, their marriage had settled into a pattern of resigned acceptance. Louisa Ulrika had learned that revolution requires a willing partner, and Adolf Frederick had learned that his wife's ambitions far exceeded his own capabilities. Their union produced children and maintained the royal lineage, but it never produced the political transformation she had desperately sought. The February evening when Adolf Frederick sat down to his final meal, he was still the same powerless king he had always been. Despite decades of his wife's relentless pushing, his appetite for food had always been more reliable than his appetite for power. February 12, 1771 started like any other evening in the Swedish royal palace. Adolf Frederick had no way of knowing that his dinner would become the most famous meal in Swedish history, or that his death would be remembered long after his forgettable reign faded from memory. The feast that night wasn't a special occasion. No visiting dignitaries, no ceremonial banquet, no political necessity. This was simply a king indulging his well-known appetite for rich food and elaborate meals. But what began as routine royal dining quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Contemporary accounts describe a table groaning under the weight of Swedish delicacies. Lobster dominated the early courses, their shells cracked open to reveal succulent meat swimming in butter. Caviar followed, the expensive black pearls that only royalty could afford in such quantities. The salty richness of smoked herring provided another layer of indulgence, while sauerkraut added its acidic tang to the already overwhelming array of flavors. Each course would have been sufficient for a normal person's entire meal, but Adolf Frederick was far from finished. Palace servants continued bringing dish after dish, and the king continued consuming everything placed before him. His appetite seemed boundless, his capacity for rich food apparently limitless. The king's eating habits weren't exactly secret. Court observers had long noted his tendency toward excess at the dinner table. But this particular evening, something drove him beyond his usual gluttony. Whether it was stress from his political impotence, boredom with his ceremonial role, or simply the availability of exceptional food, Adolf Frederick pushed his consumption to dangerous levels. As the evening progressed, the servants began preparing the dessert course. In Swedish tradition, this meant semla, sweet buns filled with almond paste and whipped cream, served floating in bowls of warm milk. The dessert, known as hetväg, when served this way, was rich enough to satisfy most people with a single serving. Adolf Frederick, however, was not most people. Historical records suggest he consumed serving after serving of the decadent dessert, the sweetness and cream adding to an already overburdened digestive system. Witnesses reported that he finished at least 14 separate servings of semla. an amount that would challenge even the most dedicated glutton. The king's behavior that evening goes beyond simple overeating. Medical experts today recognize the signs of what might have been a binge-eating episode, possibly triggered by psychological stress or underlying health conditions. The sheer volume of food he consumed, rich proteins, fatty fish, acidic vegetables, and cream-heavy desserts, created a perfect storm in his digestive system. As the evening wore on, palace staff began noticing changes in the king's demeanor. His usual jovial nature during meals gave way to obvious discomfort. His breathing became labored, his movements sluggish. The massive quantity of food he had consumed was taking its toll, but Adolf Frederick seemed unable or unwilling to stop. The final servings of Semla proved to be the breaking point. The combination of heavy cream, sweet almond paste, and warm milk added to an already catastrophic digestive load. His stomach, stretched beyond its natural capacity, began showing signs of serious distress. By the time the meal concluded, Adolf Frederick was clearly in physical distress, though no one yet understood the severity of his condition. The human stomach, under normal circumstances, can expand to hold about 1 liter of food and liquid. Adolf Frederick had pushed his digestive system far beyond these natural limits, and his body was beginning to rebel against the assault he had inflicted upon it. Within hours of finishing his massive meal, the king began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Palace physicians were summoned, but 18th-century medicine had little understanding of the acute gastric conditions that were likely developing in the royal patient. The pain intensified as his stomach, stretched beyond its capacity, struggled to process the enormous volume of rich food he had consumed. Modern medical analysis suggests Adolf Frederick was probably suffering from acute gastric dilatation, a dangerous condition where the stomach becomes so distended that it cannot empty properly. The combination of solid foods, liquids, and the natural gases produced during digestion created a deadly pressure cooker inside his abdomen. The 14 servings of Semla floating in warm milk would have been particularly problematic. Cream and milk products take significant time to digest under normal circumstances, but when consumed in such massive quantities, they can essentially create a blockage in the digestive system. The almond paste would have added further complexity, creating a dense, difficult-to-process mass in his already overwhelmed stomach. As the night progressed, the king's condition deteriorated rapidly. Historical accounts describe him experiencing severe bloating, his abdomen visibly distended from the enormous meal. The pain became excruciating as his stomach, unable to process or expel its contents, began to fail entirely. Palace physicians applied the limited treatments available to them: bloodletting, herbal remedies, and various folk cures that had no real medical efficacy. They were essentially helpless against a condition they couldn't understand, watching their king suffer from what was likely a form of gastric rupture or complete digestive system failure. The physical mechanics of what happened to Adolf Frederick were brutally simple. His stomach, forced to contain far more than it could safely hold, began to shut down. The normal muscular contractions that move food through the digestive system became impossible. Toxins that should have been eliminated began building up in his system, creating a cascade of organ failure. Medical experts today recognize that consuming such massive quantities of rich food, particularly dairy products and fatty proteins, can trigger a condition called acute gastric necrosis. The stomach tissue, deprived of proper blood flow due to extreme distension, begins to die. The process is excruciating and, in the 18th century, absolutely fatal. The king's breathing became increasingly labored as his diaphragm was compressed by his swollen abdomen. His heart, forced to work harder to pump blood through his distressed system, began showing signs of strain. What had started as a simple case of what happens when a human stomach encounters 14 servings of rich Swedish pastry soaked in hot milk. Medical experts today can paint a horrifying picture that makes Adolf Frederick's final hours seem like a scene from a medical nightmare. The king's digestive system faced an assault it was never designed to handle, and the consequences were as predictable as they were gruesome. Your stomach, under normal circumstances, can stretch to accommodate about 1 liter of food. Adolf Frederick forced his to contain nearly 4 times that amount in a single evening. Modern gastroenterologists examining the historical accounts point to acute gastric dilatation as the most likely culprit. This condition occurs when the stomach expands beyond its elastic limits, creating pressure that can literally tear the organ apart from the inside. The sequence of events would have been agonizing. First came the lobster, caviar, and smoked herring, already pushing his digestive system to its breaking point. Then the sauerkraut added acidic bulk that began fermenting in his stomach. But those 14 servings of Semla delivered the killing blow. Each portion contained thick cream, marzipan, and bread, all soaking in scalding milk that would have created a dense, expanding mass in his gut. Within hours, Adolf Frederick would have experienced symptoms that palace physicians had no way to treat. His stomach wall, stretched beyond endurance, likely began developing microtears that leaked digestive acids into his abdominal cavity. The king would have felt crushing pressure in his chest as his distended stomach pressed against his diaphragm, making each breath a struggle. Some medical historians suggest an even more catastrophic scenario: complete gastric rupture. When a stomach tears open, partially digested food and corrosive stomach acid flood the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis. Death from this condition in 1771 was certain and excruciating. The victim experiences waves of unbearable pain as their body goes into shock from the internal poisoning. The timeline fits perfectly with witness descriptions of the king's final hours. Adolf Frederick complained of severe abdominal pain shortly after his feast, followed by difficulty breathing and profuse sweating. These symptoms align exactly with acute gastric dilatation progressing toward rupture. Modern emergency medicine might have saved him with immediate surgical intervention, but 18th century physicians could only watch helplessly as their monarch's digestive system destroyed itself. Contemporary accounts mention the king's abdomen became visibly distended, another telltale sign of gastric dilatation. His body was essentially being poisoned from within by his own digestive juices, now free-floating in places they were never meant to be. The inflammation and infection that followed would have sent his body into septic shock within hours. What makes this medical catastrophe even more disturbing is how preventable it was. Adolf Frederick had shown signs of overeating throughout his reign, suggesting a pattern of digestive stress that weakened his stomach lining over time. His final feast wasn't just a single act of gluttony, it was the culmination of years of pushing his body beyond its limits. The king essentially spent decades preparing his digestive system for this moment of spectacular self-destruction. The most chilling aspect: Adolf Frederick likely remained conscious through much of this ordeal, feeling every stage of his stomach's failure as his body slowly poisoned itself from within. You won't find detailed eyewitness accounts of King Adolf Frederick's final feast in Swedish royal archives, and there's a disturbing reason why. The dramatic tale of a monarch eating himself to death emerged not from immediate documentation but from stories that crystallized in the weeks and months following his sudden demise. This absence of contemporary records raises uncomfortable questions about what really happened that February night in 1771. Palace protocol demanded meticulous documentation of royal activities, yet not a single courtier, servant, or dining companion left a detailed account of the king's supposed gluttony. The closest thing to immediate documentation comes from official death announcements that simply stated the king died after falling ill following dinner. No mention of 14 servings of Semla, no description of desperate overeating. Just the bland administrative language of royal mortality. This documentary void is particularly suspicious given the sensational nature of what allegedly occurred. Royal courts thrived on gossip, and servants were notorious for spreading details of their master's private moments. If Adolf Frederick truly consumed such a spectacular quantity of food in front of witnesses, someone would have recorded the grotesque specifics immediately. Instead, the vivid details of his final meal emerged gradually, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The earliest detailed accounts appeared several weeks after the king's death, crafted by writers who weren't present at the feast. These secondary sources describe the menu with precise specificity, listing exact quantities and courses as if they had personally observed every bite. But this precision feels manufactured, too perfect to have emerged from genuine recollection passed through multiple sources. Court records from that period do confirm that Adolf Frederick dined at home on February 12th and fell ill afterward, but they provide none of the lurid details that would later define his legacy. When news of King Adolf Frederick's death spread through Stockholm's cobblestone streets, the public reaction revealed more about Swedish attitudes toward their monarchy than any political treatise could. The citizens who had lived under his 20-year reign received word of his passing with a mixture of bemused surprise and dark humor that would have been unthinkable in more autocratic kingdoms. Swedish commoners had grown accustomed to their king's political irrelevance. Adolf Frederick's reign coincided with the Age of Liberty, when parliamentary power had reduced the crown to little more than ceremonial decoration. Most Swedes could barely recall a significant decision their monarch had made independently, so when they learned he had died from overeating, the response wasn't grief or shock, but rather a collective shrug that seemed to say, "Well, that sounds about right." Stockholm's taverns and marketplaces buzzed with gallows humor about their late king's final meal. Citizens joked about royal appetites and made crude puns about eating oneself to death. The lack of reverence was striking, especially compared to the elaborate mourning rituals that typically followed royal deaths. Instead of solemn processions and tearful vigils, Sweden's capital witnessed something closer to morbid entertainment. This casual response reflected deeper truths about monarchical power in 18th-century Sweden. The people had watched Adolf Frederick struggle against parliamentary constraints for 2 decades, witnessing his repeated failures to assert meaningful authority. His death by overeating seemed like a fitting metaphor for a reign defined by excess without substance, consumption without achievement. The political establishment reacted with similar detachment. Parliamentary leaders expressed perfunctory condolences while immediately turning attention to succession arrangements. No major political factions attempted to manipulate the king's death for advantage, largely because his living presence had carried so little weight. The transition of power proceeded smoothly, almost anticlimactically, proving how thoroughly the Swedish system had marginalized royal authority. Foreign diplomatic corps stationed in Stockholm reported back to their capitals with barely concealed amusement about the Swedish king who ate himself to death. European courts, many still operating under absolute monarchy, found the episode simultaneously horrifying and comical. It reinforced their existing prejudices about Swedish political weakness and the dangers of allowing parliaments too much power. The Swedish nobility occupied a more complex position in this reaction. Many had personal relationships with Adolf Frederick and genuine affection for his character, even while acknowledging his political limitations. Their response mixed personal sadness with professional relief that his death wouldn't disrupt the established order they had worked decades to create. What truly distinguished the public reaction was its brevity. Within weeks, Adolf Frederick's spectacular demise had been absorbed into Swedish culture as a cautionary tale about moderation, but without the lingering political reverberations that typically followed royal deaths. The kingdom moved forward as if nothing fundamental had changed, because in practical terms nothing had. This muted response ultimately became part of Adolf Frederick's legacy. He had lived as an ineffective king and died as an object lesson about gluttony, but neither his reign nor his demise disrupted the Swedish state's fundamental operations. 2 centuries later, Adolf Frederick's death has transformed from historical footnote into cautionary legend. What started as a tragic medical episode has become Sweden's most enduring tale of royal excess. The story grew legs, walked across Europe, and settled into collective memory as the ultimate warning about gluttony. You won't find this version in most history books, but the myth overshadowed the man completely. Swedish schoolchildren learn about the king who ate himself to death long before they understand parliamentary governance or the Age of Liberty. His political irrelevance during life became irrelevant in death. Dying from 14 servings of Semla made him more famous than any treaty he never signed. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. Palace records from 1771 describe a medical emergency. By 1800, court historians were already embellishing the feast details. By 1850, the story had crystallized into pure moral theater. Each retelling added another course, another helping, another layer of excess until the historical Adolf Frederick disappeared entirely beneath the caricature of the gluttonous king. Modern Sweden embraces this dark humor. February 12th isn't officially recognized as anything, but bakeries across Stockholm still joke about Adolf Frederick's revenge when selling Semla during Fat Tuesday season. The dessert that allegedly killed a king became a national obsession. Swedes consume millions of Semla every year, each bite carrying a whisper of royal mortality. What's fascinating is how the myth serves everyone's purposes. Monarchists use it to demonstrate the dangers of absolute power unchecked by responsibility. Republicans point to it as evidence that kings are just men with expensive appetites. Nutritionists cite it in lectures about portion control. Food historians debate whether 14 Semla could actually kill someone, missing the point entirely. The medical reality gets lost in the moral narrative. Acute gastric dilatation, stomach rupture, digestive system failure, these clinical possibilities sound less compelling than death by dessert. The probably truth involves an aging man whose body couldn't process massive amounts of rich food, alcohol, and dairy. But medical accuracy doesn't make for memorable storytelling. Other European monarchs died from excess too, but their stories faded while Adolf Frederick's endured. Something about the specific nature of his final meal resonated across cultures. Everyone understands the temptation of one more bite, one more serving, one more indulgence. His death became a mirror reflecting humanity's relationship with desire and consequences. The irony cuts deep. A king who wielded almost no political power during his 20-year reign achieved immortal fame through 20 minutes of eating. His inability to control parliament mattered less than his inability to control his appetite. History remembers the meal, not the monarchy. Contemporary accounts suggest Adolf Frederick was a relatively moderate man who happened to overindulge once, with catastrophic results. But the legend demands a lifetime glutton who finally met his match in Swedish pastry. The mythologized version serves moral purposes that historical accuracy cannot match. This is how legends devour history. The real Adolf Frederick, craftsman, religious man, frustrated monarch, disappeared beneath layers of cultural storytelling. What remains is a cautionary tale dressed in royal clothing, warning against the dangers of appetite unleashed. The lesson embedded in Adolf Frederick's story transcends its historical specifics. This isn't really about Swedish monarchy or 18th century dining customs. It's about the universal human struggle with self-control and the consequences when that struggle fails spectacularly. Every culture has similar cautionary tales, but few involve actual royalty dying from actual overeating. The concrete specifics make the abstract moral lesson viscerally real. You can imagine the physical discomfort, the gradually building pressure, the moment when pleasure transformed into pain. This wasn't metaphorical excess, it was measurable excess with measurable consequences. Modern medical understanding makes the story more disturbing, not less. We know exactly what happens when stomachs rupture, when digestive systems fail, when the body's limits get exceeded catastrophically. Adolf Frederick didn't drift peacefully into eternal sleep. He experienced hours of escalating agony as his body shut down from the inside out. The timing matters too. He died at the height of Enlightenment thinking, when European intellectuals were celebrating human reason and self-control as the keys to civilization. Here was a king, supposedly the pinnacle of human achievement, reduced to animal appetite and animal death. The philosophical implications ricocheted through European courts for decades. His death also highlights the absurdity of absolute privilege meeting biological reality. All the royal physicians, all the palace luxury, all the ceremonial power meant nothing when faced with basic digestive failure. Death treated the King of Sweden exactly like any common person who ate too much too fast. The democracy of mortality made mockery of the hierarchy of birth. The story's endurance reflects something darker about human nature. We're simultaneously fascinated and repulsed by excess, especially when it destroys those who seem to have everything. Adolf Frederick's death provides safe moral superiority. We can judge his lack of self-control while secretly wondering if we'd show more restraint faced with unlimited royal feasting. Historical context makes the moral lesson more complex. This was a man with limited real power, married to an ambitious woman, ruling during a period when Swedish kings were increasingly ceremonial. The overindulgence might have been his only remaining form of absolute control. When you can't control your kingdom, perhaps you try to control your appetite, until your appetite controls you. The broader lesson extends beyond individual psychology to institutional decay. Societies that create unlimited privilege often produce unlimited excess. Adolf Frederick's death symbolized the corruption that absolute monarchy inevitably breeds. Not political corruption, but spiritual and physical corruption that rots from within. 2.5 centuries later, his story remains relevant because human appetites haven't evolved. We understand the compulsion toward excess, the difficulty of stopping when satisfaction turns to sickness. Adolf Frederick simply took that universal experience to its logical extreme, with the resources and lack of restraint that only monarchy could provide. His legacy lives on not as royal history, but as human